Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this Monday's This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined as always by Brandon Tessers, LCPC and Clinical Director of Effective Artistry. How are you doing today, Brandon?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, glad to be here. We've got a good topic for discussion today, so I'm looking forward to getting into it. But I'm going to set a little alarm to remind us to finish on time. So I'm going to do that now.
Yeah, I have a 2:00 session
today. So we got to get out of here on time today. If you're joining us in the chat, whether you're on Twitch or Facebook or joining us live on YouTube, welcome. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. We hope you join the conversation today. So feel free to add your thoughts and comments in the chat and ask questions of Brandon or myself as we go along. And if you decide that there's something else on your mind that you want to talk about, then let us know and we can take the conversation in a different direction. A little bit of housekeeping about Effective Artistry. It's a therapy and coaching practice based in Northbrook, Illinois, with a particular focus on neurodiversity. And therapists are licensed to work with anybody in the state of Illinois, and coaches at Effective Artistry can work with you anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection. If you'd like to know more about us, you can go to the website, effectiveartistry.com. If you have ideas for topics you'd like us to discuss on the Monday chat, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and on TikTok. Margaret Chouse, one of the therapists, solicits ideas and topics for conversation over on TikTok. So just search for Effective Artistry and you'll find us there. I think that's all housekeeping.
Yeah.
So,
great.
Let's get
a note. I am in a different office. We're moving, and we're in the same office suite, but we're growing here at Effective Artistry, so I've had to shift my office to what used to be the conference room. So in the process of that, so there's no art on my walls, and it is totally bothering me that there's no art on my walls.
I like the color scheme, though. It's very calming.
I'm good. I'm glad.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's great news. Practice is expanding. This is fantastic news.
Yeah, doing well. We do a particular kind of a thing. That's what we're doing on stream all the time, and I'm excited to talk about the topic today. And people are looking for that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So let's get into it. This is a topic we have kind of tiptoed around, skirted around, discussed briefly a few times. And I'm just going to pull up some of the questions we've got so far. But the topic is basically around the concept of intelligence. What the heck do we mean by intelligence? Are there different ways of defining or measuring intelligence? Well, we know there are ways of measuring intelligence. What are the pros and cons of doing that? What are different ways that we can approach the concept of intelligence to maybe be more inclusive and neurodiversity affirming? So I know you have thoughts on this.
Oh, so many.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing them. I guess as usual, we start off with the basic. What do we mean when we say the word intelligence?
And this one is, so I think the best thing to say first off is that intelligence is a construct, like love. Think of it like love, right? Do we experience things or notice things that we can then kind of encapsulate under the banner of love or under the banner of intelligence? Absolutely. What exactly is it? You're going to get a different answer from every different person that you ask.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make that connection because people have this. There is frequently or commonly a thought, a belief that intelligence is some sort of like biological, genetic, like measurable trait that a person has, like height or skin tone or whatever. And it's not that. If you look into the people who kind of have developed the concept kind of academically, the more official, Wexler and all those guys, the people who developed the IQ tests back in the day, which there are a couple of different ones, they'll give you different answers of what intelligence is. So it is one of those words that means different things all the time. But I think the way that it's most commonly used in our culture is just to talk, is a reference to this idea that there is some trait, some quality that a person has that is static within that person, but varies from that person to somebody else, that just makes you better at anything and everything. That's mostly how it's discussed, right?
Yeah.
That anything you do well, we can say you're smart, and anything you don't do well, we can say you're not smart. No wonder my tea's been leaking. My tea mug is cracked. I just found that. All right. Anyway, distracted. A lot of the time when people are using words like intelligent, unintelligent, smart, dumb, stupid, whatever, really they're just saying I like or I agree with X, Y, or Z thing, or I don't like or I don't agree with X, Y, or Z thing. Most of the time when we say that person is stupid or that was a stupid choice, we just mean I don't like that choice. I think that a different choice would have been better. If we refer to someone as being stupid, we generally just mean I don't like that person more often than not. Which is why this word is so important, because it's become conflated with basically everything. Like the total value a person has. I'm getting off on all different kinds of things. So,
Go for it.
So generally that's what people mean when they say intelligent. They just mean some not totally measurable, but we're certain that it exists, trait that explains why some people experience success more easily or more commonly than other people, but they tend to kind of make it across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't exist. You can't,
No.
IQ, what's that?
Life happens.
Right, like with all this stuff, it's just, how would we know? How would we measure that? How would we separate out all the variables to say, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with, for example, the resources that you have access to, or the experience. Also, we know that people get better at things in a broad sense the more that they do those things, and there is only so much time, there's only so much energy. You cannot do everything faster and more than everybody else. That's just not how it works to be human. So it's kind of a harmful concept in that sense, that we can just say, oh, you're intelligent. And I'll say that by the standard reckoning of intelligence, which is primarily focused around academic success, I'm a very, very intelligent person. I've been told my whole life that I'm very intelligent. I have a really high IQ on the IQ test, and I don't think most of that stuff means anything. I don't know. I think sometimes when people kind of come at this, it tends to be put out there as, oh, that person is unintelligent or whatever, and that's why they're having a problem with the concept of intelligence. So I just kind of want to make it clear. I have gained and I stand to gain from the idea of intelligence as a thing, and I think it's not a thing, and I think it's important to address that. So, past all that, generally, if you ask somebody, what do you mean by intelligence? What is intelligence? More often than not, people are going to say some version of the ability to adapt to new information or acquire new information and figure things out quickly. Something like that. Like the ability to learn quickly, which again is, learning to fish is different than learning your times tables, right? There are different types of learning, but we kind of broadly throw that all together. There are so many different ways of talking about this and what people mean by it. It helped me. I'm going to just run on forever. Help me separate it out into different things.
So we have a few questions here. So we have this concept of intelligence that we're kind of aware of, and I would have been growing up. I would have been labeled intelligent, smart, and whatever. But I would also have been labeled book smart, but not street smart. Right.
Yeah.
So that brings us to concepts of social and emotional intelligence, and so there are other ways, right, of defining this, depending, it's context dependent too, right? Although traditionally it just tends to focus on academics.
See that. So what we're talking about is the theory of multiple intelligences, and different people break it down in different ways. that there are different ways to be intelligent. And one, like you mentioned, that's been very popular, especially over the last 10 years or so, is emotional intelligence, or EQ,
Yeah.
which I think that's kind of like when we call someone a shopaholic, that like the alcohol part comes from the alcohol, like, so to say shopaholic, they're addicted to shopahol, whatever. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. So to say EQ would mean emotional quotient, not have intelligence involved at all.
Yeah.
Just kind of adopting. But anyway, here's my problem with the theory of multiple intelligence. It's not that people are good at different things. That's self-evidently true, obviously true. We know that some people are better at X and some people are better at Y, and blah, blah, blah. The problem is that it legitimizes this idea of intelligence, that instead of saying, well, intelligence is at most a very finite and limited thing that we're measuring through academics, and it doesn't matter for everything all the time, all places, no matter what. Instead of that, we're saying, oh, well, yes, being good at anything is a version of intelligence. So then we're just reinforcing this idea that intelligence is still just a word that means good at whatever, like well suited for whatever. And it glides over anything. Like, what is it that makes somebody, let's talk about the IQ, the academically focused. What is it that makes somebody perform or behave in such a way that we measure and say, oh, they're intelligent, they have an IQ? What is it that makes them perform or behave and react in such a way that we would say they have a high EQ or kinesthetic intelligence or any other thing, right? Like, if we just write it off as intelligence, this nebulous thing that a person certainly has, without ever exploring it further than that, it just turns into basically some people are good at stuff and some people are bad, and there's no understanding it and there's no point in talking about it. It's kind of ridiculous.
So let's talk a little bit about context then. So one question we have here is the construct of intelligence inherently racist and classist? There we go.
Yeah. I mean, for anybody who's interested, look up the origin of the word gifted as it relates to intelligence, right? That's a very common term, gifted. And of course, the word existed before. But to talk about someone being intelligent, the origin of that word comes from literally a eugenicist text, not a book by a eugenicist who happened to be writing about intelligence, but the book itself was arguing that you could divide people into 4 categories and that only the people from the top 2 categories should be allowed to procreate, and gifted was the second. The top category was preeminent. This was a very common argument for a lot of the 19th century, the idea that goodness or badness, fitness or unfitness, whatever version of it you want to call it, is somehow genetic, hereditary, it's in the biology, and that it was used to make arguments about, you've got to marry upstanding people who are like you so that you can have good kids. If you marry somebody who isn't, your kids will be messed up, kind of stuff. So it is, yes, inherently, classist, sexist, racist, whatever version of that. Now, how it's applied is a little different than that. Doesn't mean it's not those things. It is those things, probably even more than it inherently needs to be, right? There's some element of it that is racist, classist, etc., that has been built into it over time that it wouldn't inherently need to be. But no matter what you do in changing the system, the idea that person A and person B, person A is better in some undefinable way at everything, or at least at a set of skills, acquiring new information, adapting to new information, whatever, at a set of skills which applies to everything, that applies to anything a person can do, then yes, you are. It's not like saying tall and short, where we could argue that in some contexts it's better to be tall and others it's better to be short. This is something where we would be saying it's always better to be intelligent. Like, if you go with that standard definition of intelligence, that's my question for you, is in what case, in what context would it be better to be less intelligent than more intelligent? And nobody can answer that question because of how we talk about that word. It just means good at everything. And that's a huge problem, especially when it comes to neurodiversity and mental health, mental illness, that whatever framework you want to use to talk about this. The idea that some people are innately and inherently just better at everything than other people are with no explanation is really problematic.
Yeah.
For people on both sides, by the way, too. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between, former gifted kid or ex-gifted kid and people who are discovering that they're neurodivergent or identifying as neurodivergent as adults. There's a ton of overlap in this stuff.
Yeah.
So that concept of it gets in the way. And I should say, 15 minutes in, I suppose, but I think there is utility, just like with love or with confidence or courage, any of these constructs, there's utility in these words, in these constructs. They exist for a reason. We use them. And I think there is some stuff that's worth exploring in terms of what we might want to actually call intelligence, like what definition we would want to apply to it. But we can't get to any of that before getting through this whole thing that right now, for most people, when you hear intelligent, it just means good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned people finding out later in life that they might be neurodivergent, and how that connects to intelligence. How does that show up for people in the classroom or outside of the classroom?
So before starting effective artistry, I worked at a practice, the Center for Identity Potential, that specializes in working with gifted and twice exceptional people, which, just real quick, twice exceptional is a term that means gifted and also with a learning disability. Because one of the downsides of talking about intelligence as though it is this just universally good thing to be more of than less of, is that for people who are then identified as being intelligent, any of their struggles, any of the things that they have problems with tend to get dismissed. Of like, no, you're smart, you could do it. Just try harder or whatever. Like, I know you can do this. The concept of potential, for example, comes up all the time. And it's a terrible concept. Why would we ever talk about a person's potential? That just means things that we think they can do, but that they aren't currently doing. So inherently, it is a statement of you should be doing things that you are not doing. It's not a nice thing to tell someone they have great potential. It's a backhanded compliment. So gifted, twice exceptional. So twice exceptional kind of came later. That's in the 90s or so that started coming around, because that was the first that anyone ever wanted to try to acknowledge, like, people can be smart and also have ADHD, or people can be smart and also be autistic. Of course, this is all through the deficit model, right? That they're thinking of these things as being bad things. So twice exceptional means you're exceptional in a good way, you're intelligent, and you're exceptional in a bad way, you have a learning disability. It's obviously problematic itself. It's better than what came before, the idea that you could not struggle and be intelligent at the same time. That's even worse than the idea that you can have both things going on. But it's limited too. There's, I think, some fairly obvious problems with talking about it in terms of twice exceptionality. But anyway, as far as how that manifests in the classroom, like you're talking about, and I think this does tend to be, there's some research behind this, but I don't know the research well enough, so I'm going to say this is anecdotal. But women, young girls especially in school, have a tendency to internalize things. That young girls with ADHD, they have that impulse, that need to fidget and force themselves not to at a higher rate than young boys with ADHD force themselves not to fidget, right? Not that it's any given individual can go any different kind of a way, but there's a concept that we used to talk about, well, that they still talk about a lot in giftedness, called compensation, which just means you're utilizing your intelligence to compensate for some other deficit. So a very common pattern of that, and most of the people who are showing up to our streams over and over probably can identify with this, is I get behind, I couldn't keep up on my work, or I do my work and I wouldn't turn it in, it would get lost, all these executive function difficulties, blah, blah, blah. But I was really good at the tests. Or I put off my paper over and over and over and over again, but then I would write it the night before and it would still get a good grade. Or I wouldn't do my work and I'd struggle all semester long, and then towards the end of the quarter, the end of the semester, I'd go talk to my teacher and they loved me and I'm charming and they would help me out and I would do some kind of extra credit stuff to get my grade up. A lot of compensation where I'm not doing it the way that theoretically on paper we're supposed to be doing it, but I find some way to make up for it and end up getting good grades anyway. Because for people who are finding out or identifying as neurodivergent later in life, that means they weren't identified when they were young And that almost always means that they got good grades.
Yeah.
Because if you identify as neurodivergent, there are reasons that you're looking at, like in terms of ADHD or autism or dyslexia or whatever version of it that you're looking at, or just kind of the whole mishmash like we were talking about last week. That stuff didn't just appear out of nowhere, but there are limited resources in the school system. We can't, because of the way things are structured, I'm not saying this should be this way, but this is how it is. The reality is that we cannot provide services to every single child. That's not what the way that the system is structured. So we have to identify who needs it. And if you're getting good grades, it doesn't really matter what other things you're experiencing. They're not really going to identify you as being someone that needs to get tested and looked into and whatever. It's only when you're struggling academically, and I'll say but really mostly and causing problems in the classroom, disruption, or teacher doesn't know how to get you to do your work or turn in your work or whatever. Pretty rare that if you get good grades and cause disruption in the classroom that you still get evaluated for ADHD. Although I think that's becoming more common these days. So that's what it looks like. A lot of teachers' pets, for example, like, I don't know.
Like we have in class.
Yeah. Or, they're so wonderful, they're really bright and quick, but they talk too much. All that fun stuff in the classroom. But I don't, I always want to be careful about giving a pattern of people that are going to identify as like, oh, that's me, and that means XYZ, or oh, that's not me, and that means something else.
Yeah, for sure. Like for my own experience was everything went fine until halfway through college. The first time the wheels just came off, I just hit a wall. I had no study skills to speak of because I was really good at getting my work done the night before. I didn't really need to study for a lot of stuff, and that gets you so far, but it's not sustainable.
In the work I used to do in giftedness, we would talk about that. We call it hitting the wall. That all of a sudden you go from a straight A student to a straight F student, like out of nowhere, and everybody's confused and doesn't know what happened. And it's because of like what you're talking about. Your way of getting through gets you through until it doesn't, and once it doesn't, you don't have a different way of getting through, so it just falls apart completely. And it does. There are certain transitions where we see it happen more frequently. 3rd grade to 4th grade. 5th to 6th, or grade school to middle school or junior high or whatever. Middle school to high school to college tend to be the big ones. And of course, it can happen at any point to anybody for a million different reasons. But one of the problems there is even this, the way you identified it, which is a common, like that's what we always used to talk about, right? That's what they still talk about in giftedness, is because of your raw intelligence, which remember, what are we talking about? But we just assume that there's something there. Because of your raw intelligence, you're compensating with your raw intelligence and therefore never developing study skills because you don't need to. But then someday something happens and your raw intelligence isn't enough, and because it isn't enough, you then don't have these study skills developed because you never needed them. But there's like logical problems in that way of talking about it, right? Because wouldn't theoretically someone have always originally needed to develop study skills? Right? Like if that's why we develop study skills is because we have to, then every single person has to have had an experience where they, for the first time, are like, oh crap, I need study skills and I don't have them. So what makes yours different or mine different or whatever, right? What are even these study skills that we're talking about? And notice how conveniently this takes all the pressure off of the teachers, the educators, the professors, for scaling you up and scaffolding things appropriately, and just saying, if you're struggling to do what I'm asking you to do, it can't possibly be anything to do with what it is I'm asking you to do or the ways in which I'm supporting you or preparing you to do those things. It must be some deficit of yours. So here's my challenge for people who talk like that, because we do all the time. I just need to study more. What the hell do you mean by study? What specifically do you mean by studying? What specific observable set of actions, behaviors, would you call studying? Because people generally can't answer that question. And what makes you so certain that other people are doing it? Have you asked anybody? Marie, you've been in academia for a long time. Have you ever seen anybody do all the things that theoretically are like mental image of a good hard study worker, good student. Have you ever seen anybody who starts all their assignments the day they're assigned and finishes them early and tracks everything?
Never.
Yeah.
Nobody does. Yeah.
Nobody does this.
No.
Nobody. And the idea that some people do, just like last week talking about neurotypical, it gets in the way of progress because it makes it a convenient explanation for why you're struggling. Why are you struggling? Because you're not doing this stuff that everybody else does, even though nobody's doing it. So each individual person is thinking, oh man, I'm just bad at my study skills and whatever. And everybody is struggling with the same stuff, not in the same way or to the same extent, or not all the same.
Mm.
That fictional idea of that student, there's no real, I've never met anyone like that.
Yeah. I was talking to a client last night and we touched on this topic. And we talked about kids who would be deemed disruptive in class, or who, might have acted out once and upset or annoyed the teacher so much that they're sort of branded afterwards as problematic or a troublemaker.
Yeah.
And we talked about kids we've known who were actually really bright and insightful and had a talent for certain subjects and were bored to tears in other subjects, or who maybe needed to just get up and run around the classroom and burn off some energy. And how, as you say, the resources aren't there to accommodate different ways of learning or different students in this way. But we have a tendency then to sort of dismiss some young people as not going to live up to their potential, or not going to achieve anything.
Yeah.
Because they're disruptive, or they're trying to tell their teacher something by acting like this, or they're trying to express something, whether it's frustration or boredom or irritation or whatever, or simply, I don't understand the material you're teaching me, or I don't understand the way you're communicating it to me.
Yeah.
The teacher just sees somebody who's being disruptive.
And as a way to kind of drive home the point about intelligence, that in that gifted, literally people who work in the industry, the gifted industry, refer to it as gifted land, that kind of world. In gifted land, a very common, like something everybody will say, and it's just understood to be true, is that often the kids that are acting out in class or whatever are gifted and unsupported, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll give different explanations. A common one is that they're bored because the material is too slow, which is another really problematic, even though it makes sense as a narrative, a very problematic narrative. But anyway, well, guess what? If you're disruptive in class, they're not going to evaluate you for giftedness. The school is not going to jump to, oh, I bet this person is a gifted kid who's not supported well. So the kids who are disruptive in class, but then get evaluated and found out, oh, it's actually that they're gifted or twice exceptional. Guess who those kids are? The ones whose parents can afford private evaluations, which cost thousands of dollars, right?
Right.
So, yeah, here we're back to classism and racism and sexism and all the isms. Even within, like, without intelligence, just this is kind of off topic talking about intelligence, but I think it's worth noting that young white boys are very disproportionately likely to get diagnosed as having ADHD. Young black boys are very disproportionately likely to get diagnosed as having what's called ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, a disorder that basically just means they do stuff that adults don't want them to do. Literally in the diagnostic criteria, one of the symptomatic requirements is that they engage in behavior which annoys people around them. That's like an actual, it's in the book,
So they could be engaging in the very same behavior that their white classmate could be engaging in, but it'll be viewed completely differently because.
Sure. And what's more than that isn't annoyance also kind of individual? So doesn't that kind of depend on who it is you're around? Like leaving even race and other things aside of it, like one teacher might find what I'm doing to be charming and engaging, and another teacher might find it to be annoying. So it's just luck of the draw, right? Mm-hmm. It's this whole thing is ridiculous. And everything made sense every step of the way. This is why I always go back, or at least so frequently go back and talk about the history of things, because I think it's important to understand why things became the way that they are, so that we can see the value in it. Otherwise, again, we're just going to write it off as like, oh, everybody's a monster, and the secret, whatever people that rule the world are doing all this stuff that's monstrous on purpose, which, maybe that's true. But if it was true, then the things that we would do to try and change things are based around that idea, which tends to not be useful, as opposed to, no, everyone's doing everything that they're doing for reasons, and we need to understand those reasons. Because, like, that's what we're saying, right? You just said that these kids are trying to express frustration or boredom or blah, 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 or whatever. They're need to do this other stuff. So what we're saying is, oh, even when people do things that you don't like or that actually do cause problems for you, they actually are disruptive, even though we're trying to be nice and generous and how it still does cause problems. But when people do things like that, we want to understand that there are reasons that they do it, so that you don't just write it as bad. Well, it goes the other way too. Educators do things the way they do them for reasons, and we're not going to just write them off as bad. If you do that, you're not going to have much success.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know what it's like in the US. I've heard it's not great, but in terms of funding and resources and the rest, it's not great here in the UK. I know it's quite challenging in Ireland, to be able to support kids and to feel supported in your job as an educator as well.
Yeah, and some of this isn't even about resources too, although certainly that's a big part of it. Some of it is just the nature of how this stuff has been set up. Give a teacher all the money in the world, but you ask one teacher to teach a class with, even if it's down to 10 or 12 kids, which would be a very small class size in most places. Well, they still have only so many hours in the day, and we teach 10 or 12 kids. So the activities, the curriculum all needs to be designed around what's going to work for most people most of the time. And you can build in exceptions and you can build in differentiation, all of those things, but there are limits. And you're asking there to be, I mean, unless you're going to say that we're going to switch and do it in a kind of one-for-one kind of a way, or community-led kind of a way, like a whole different model, which I think there's a lot of value in those other models. But as long as we're doing this one teacher in a classroom full of kids, resources isn't the only issue. Even if the teacher is wonderful and amazing, has all the funding in the world, those kids are still going to compete. They're still going to say, I want to get a good grade, and when other people get a better grade than me, I feel bad, or when I get a better grade than other people, I feel good. People are telling them that getting good grades is good and getting bad grades is bad, which has to be done. Mm-hmm. This system literally will not work at all without grades and the idea that good grades is good and bad grades is bad.
Yeah.
It's a necessary part of it. So it's unfortunate, and there's a lot of elements that are unfortunate, and you can look at changes, and a lot of people are, and I have some documents with a lot of educators, and all different things. And you gotta understand what we're up against. Like some things are just difficult, even though nobody is making them difficult. The whole point of systems thinking is to say that a system, the way in which pieces are arranged, can result in outcomes being different than any individual member of that system wants it to be. If we're just going to say that somebody wants the outcome of the system to be what it is in every single case, then what's the point of the system? We're just talking about some people have the power to make it what they want. Yeah. I want what's best, you want what's best, but because of how this is structured, we're both doing our best to get what's best, and what comes out is bad anyway. Mm-hmm.
Just to say that there's a little bit of there's a problem with your audio. I think it's just a little bit muffled.
Oh. See, I
just kind of keeps
things around kind of. Yeah, that's. Keep for telling me that should be better.
Oh, that's clearer. Yeah, that's much better.
Moving things around and stuff, the settings got changed, and I didn't think to check it and make sure they were back to the right mic.
Thank you. Yeah, that's way better. I've had some experience tutoring at a university level, and it's usually small group sessions, but I've also tutored in big, spacious, noisy, echoey labs with high ceilings, and you might have 60 people in the room, and I've met other people who have ADHD who find that setup quite distracting and uncomfortable and a sensory nightmare. And I have had that experience trying to tutor them. And I briefly tried substitute teaching for grade school, I guess you'd call it, like primary age kids. And my hat is off to anybody who can manage a classroom with 35 and 6-year-olds in it for an entire school day. So yeah, the system is not optimal. not for educators, and certainly not for students, particularly anybody who's twice exceptional, or yeah. So,
and this is one of those times where there isn't necessarily a way to do it that gets rid of all the problems, right? We can improve on it or choose different problems than the ones that we have, but the nature of academia, and hopefully this can lead us back into talking about intelligence and what we think of it as, or what I think of it as, and how it's useful. But like, to make something academic means to remove it from the context in which it's actually relevant to your life. Like, that's what it means to say, oh, it's an academic point. It means it doesn't actually really matter. There is a reason that we want to do that as humans. There's a reason that we want to say, okay, this information or this skill is not actually relevant to your life, but we want to give it to you now because we think that later on it will be relevant to your life and you'll be better off if you've acquired and developed that now before it's necessary. But there's an inherent problem with that, cognitive miser, right? The brain needs a reason. It doesn't spend resources for no reason. So we don't learn things that we don't have any reason to learn. So one way in which this works academically is to just have that kind of relationship with the educator, whether it's your parent or whomever it is, the person who's trying to teach you something, your friend, whatever, that you like them, you trust them, and they're telling you that this is a good thing to learn. And so you focus for that reason, for that trust. But that's totally built on a relationship, and oftentimes will still only result in you learning the version of it that you need to learn in order to give that person the impression that you've learned it. Not even intentionally, right? Like, you think you're learning it as thoroughly as it can be learned, but you're learning it through somebody else. So you can't know any of the nuances and details that they don't know and haven't presented to you, or that they just assume you would know and they didn't need to present to you, for example. If you want a good, like, real life example of this, try calling up someone in your family who is 60, 70 years old or older and walking them through doing something you consider to be simple on a computer. And very quickly you'll find out, like, how much, oh, okay, I'm just assuming that you know what it means to click or double click, or what a menu is, or like all the things that need to be established in order to actually convey something. So there's that. Another way to do it is to do what we do is grades. We make it relevant in an arbitrary way. We say, if you learn this thing, even though it doesn't actually matter in an observable way intrinsically in your life, but it matters because I will think better of you or less of you, or I will reward you or I will punish you. I'll give you a good grade if you do it, and I'll give you a bad grade if you don't. That's what I was saying earlier. It has to be. We cannot change the system as it is currently constructed to say, yeah, Fs don't matter. There's no problem with them. Because it's not a matter of quote unquote motivation, the way that a lot of people would talk about it. It's a matter of, that's the only reason the brain has to bother learning most of this stuff. Because what we can do, and what happens if you ask anybody about their, like, favorite teachers, right? What can happen, but is very difficult, is that people can explain the reasoning. Not, you should learn this so that you get a good grade, or you should learn this because you'll need to know how to do this at the next level in high school or in college or whatever. But this is why we collectively have determined that this is something useful for children to learn for these specific reasons. And then you can understand, oh, I can see why it would be good for me to learn this independently of whether or not you give me a good grade or a bad grade. But that's really, really difficult. And we don't train people to do that. Like my favorite example, why do we have to learn to do this math, right? A question everybody asks, why do we need to learn math? And the standard answer is because you won't always have a calculator. And everyone brings this up because it's silly, because we all have calculators in our pockets all the time now. But even without that, let's assume we didn't have calculators. That's still not an answer. Like, what is the thing that would be happening where being able to either do math or have a calculator would be useful? And no one can explain that to these kids, because no one really has an answer for it, honestly, for most of the math that we teach. Not all of it, but for most of it, there isn't an answer, at least not the way that we teach it. I think there are good answers for why people should learn math, certain types of math, and in certain ways, but they don't work with the way that we currently generally teach math. It's a very like linear and memorization focused. If we teach it as a language and a problem solving set and reasoning and logic, I think that's very across the board useful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, I don't know. When's the last time you used any math beyond, hell, even pre-algebra, right? Like, when's the last time you did a matrix or balanced an equation? Like,
yeah.
When's the last time you looked at an equation where it was even relevant to take a term from one side of the equation and eliminate it by subtracting it from both sides or whatever? I don't know, people say, well, you got to do your taxes. You don't do that on your taxes.
Nope.
So, but then you got the other side of it is, well, we have to have some large scale way to be able to determine. If we just put kids in a classroom and say, well, let's rely on the teacher to just know what they're doing and pick the curriculum, then any individual teacher could be teaching kids things that were like, no, that's incorrect, or no, that's not useful, or so we have to have some way to standardize it. And then that brings us back to, well, then we're teaching every teacher to teach the same thing without teaching them why we're asking them to teach it, other than because it's the curriculum and I have to.
Yeah, we're not just changing students by doing that. We're shortchanging the teachers as well.
Yeah, and there's not a solution.
No.
It's a balance thing, or I like to talk about these things as tension. The more you go in one direction, the further you're getting from the other side, and you go too far and it causes problems, so you correct and go back. But then you get too far and it causes problems, and you correct and you go back and you try and dial it in as best you can. But this isn't just like being human, right? Like we talk about, like there's not a way to go to therapy or any other process and learn a set of information and skills and now you're good forever. There's no way to create a process here that's just going to work forever and it's no problem. We look at the problems, we address them and correct them, identify, and then those things are going to cause new problems. And when it does, we got to be ready to address and correct that stuff. Because otherwise, what are we doing?
Yeah. All right, let's get back to intelligence and the definition of intelligence. So my question is, if you could redefine the concept or the word to mean what you think it should mean, what would that be?
So I do use the term intelligence to mean two different things. One is just an ability, a mechanism that all humans possess, like sight, right? Not a comparative statistic that I have more sight than you have or whatever. The other is more of that trait. So we'll start with the first. Intelligence, my favorite way to define it for people, because it really just gets people's attention. Intelligence is the ability to distance yourself from reality. And we all have it.
Ooh.
We all utilize it. What it means is, in the conscious space, the point of what consciousness is whatever it is, however it's come to be, and we have no idea, but whatever it is, I can be aware of things and do things in that space which have no relationship to the physical environment around me. I can imagine things that are not located in any physical way in my environment. Including, by the way, I'm not just saying like dragons and whatever. I'm saying like I can imagine what's going to happen 2 hours from now, which has none of what I'm imagining. Oh, I've got to remember to run to the grocery store later. Like I'm not at the grocery store. Later doesn't exist. Only now actually exists. So if we only can pay attention to the physical reality around us, that's very limiting. We have no ability to project into the future and say, well, this would be the best thing to do right now in this moment. But if I do this other thing instead, that'll pay off later on. Which is what every living thing, I suppose, probably has some measure of intelligence by this definition. No, I don't know, maybe not. Like plants, do plants like plan for the future? I don't know. Not in some
Well, there is a theory that plants communicate with one another. I don't know if you've ever heard of Suzanne Simard,
I have no.
Canadian botanist, who has there's a book about the concept of the mother tree in a forest. And so when trees are dying, they will send out chemical signals through the root system, and they will send out nutrients from their own decaying bodies to sustain the younger trees within the forest.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's a form of intelligence. It's a method of communicating to keep.
See, the way that we're talking about it necessitates consciousness, the ability to conceptualize a time or a space which is not the current time or space. Because otherwise, it's just stimulus response, right?
Mhm.
Like I eat, if I get hungry and I eat, that's just a stimulus response that involves no consciousness. If I am not hungry and I eat because I'm thinking, well, I won't have another chance to eat until blah, 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 then that involves consciousness, and that's intelligence. So in that particular, not that obviously there's all kinds of complexity to it that I don't know, but my base understanding of it would be that it doesn't necessarily mean there's intelligence there. It could just be that in response to the things that are happening when a tree is dying, which is the stimulus, then the response is it sends out those other things.
Mhm.
There's no conscious state of I'm doing this because I'm imagining a possible future in which it would be beneficial to do this.
By that token, then, is intelligence something that's innately human?
I think, well, it certainly is much more, humans do it much more by, orders of magnitude than anything else. I don't know, I'm not a biologist and I couldn't say, but my guess is that no, it's not only humans that do this. But I don't know. And it's a construct. I don't even know how we'd really measure, like, how would we really say that a squirrel isn't consciously thinking about the winter when it's burying nuts? It's just following an instinct, right? And then we got to ask the same questions about humans. Well, how can we say that I'm not just doing what I'm doing as an instinctual response to whatever? It's just a very complicated one that I can't observe, all the workings of. I don't know. It gets into this whole, but it's certainly something we do more. And from self-report, from my experience and from the experiences that people share, which I assume that I'm understanding to some level of, not completely accurately, but to some extent, it's something we all do. Like we zone out, right? Like I'm not present. We have all kinds of phrases for this, like staring into the middle distance, or, hey, you're somewhere else right now. Oh, my mind is on my body's here, but my mind is in, or my heart is in. We have an ability to observe some form of information or something and interact with it that does not originate in our physical environment. So
being away with the fairies is how we say it at home.
And of course, those are very exaggerated versions of it, where because attention is finite, right? So that only so much of it can go. There's a reason that like certain activities that we do get us out of our head, because the attention has to go to the physical environment and we don't have anything left for going here. And then we go into our head. There's a reason we use these phrases, that we're spending our attention on what's happening in here. Not that it necessarily isn't happening. It might be happening even when we're not paying attention to it, but how would we know? Like, who's going to observe it? You have to observe it. So what would that? All this gets real philosophical. But I think that's a useful way of talking about intelligence as a mechanism, as a thing. It's a way of referring to the fact that we can engage with stuff in our conscious space. We can do things in there. And that different versions of what we do can help us or hurt us. That's, if we're going to talk about it as a trait, it has to be that it is situationally advantageous or disadvantageous. If it is globally advantageous, then why doesn't every human have it to the same extent? Why don't we all use it the exact same to the maximum amount possible if it's good for everything all the time? It can't be. It has to be that it is well suited for some things and causes problems in other things, which is really what we're talking about with twice exceptionality. And honestly, I think a big part of what we're talking about when we're talking about neurodiversity is in order to identify as neurodivergent, you have to have a concept of yourself and somebody else, or the norm or whatever, and they have to be different. Well, your concept of somebody else and what's happening in their head is not in your physical reality. You're thinking about it. That's conscious thought. That's intelligence, right? Like, in order to be neurodivergent, I think means that you are utilizing intelligence perhaps disproportionately to the utility of it, right? Like, you think about stuff more than is always helpful.
Right.
That's what autism, by the way, like, again, one of these words that everybody says and nobody thinks about. Root word auto, A-U-T-O, self. Autism, it was named for the idea of it when it was named was that these are people who are in their own world, meaning they're in their conscious space, that they're not paying much attention to the physical reality of the environment around them proportionately, right? Enough to navigate it, walk, right? Enough to whatever thing that they're doing, but not enough or not in the way necessary in order for them to do whatever thing I am thinking that they should do in this moment. Sometimes accurately, right? Like, sometimes there are things where it's like, no, it actually would be, to the best of anyone's knowledge, beneficial if you were to do this and you're doing this other thing instead. I'm not trying to make it all judgmental. I'm just.
No. As you say, though, it's about how we are observing somebody else's behavior. That's how we define it, right?
Yeah. So to me, when I'm talking about intelligence as a trait, what I'm talking about is the predisposition to utilize intelligence, the mechanism, as a problem-solving technique. In other words, when a problem occurs, when I become aware of a problem, I could theoretically do something right then and there, just physically engage in some behavior intended to solve the problem, or I can think about it and try and run through these scenarios, because that's what this is for, right? That's the advantage of this, is to say, I can imagine, and I can't do it perfectly. I can't predict the future. I can't know what will happen, but various different things, experiences and knowledge, whatever, help it so that my ability to make predictions is more useful or less useful in particular ways. I could just do something, or I can think, well, what if I did this? How would that go? Okay, fine, not so great. What if I did this other thing? Oh, that's better. What if I did this? Oh no, that's terrible, right? Like, it's a completely physically safe space to run these scenarios, to say, what if I blank? So, very common, by the way. We don't have time for all the ego dystonic intrusive thought stuff, right? When you think things that you're like, oh, does that mean something bad about me? Super common one. You're driving down the road and you just think, what if I just swerved off the edge of the road? Especially on high, twisty mountain paths, like, or a bridge where swerving off the edge of the road would be terrible. The glitch is that sometimes people will then say, like, oh no, does that mean I want to? No, it doesn't mean you want to. Your brain, your consciousness, what it is for is running scenarios. What if this? Oh no, that wouldn't be good. I shouldn't do that. What if this? Yeah, that would be good. I'll do that to the best of my ability to determine. So to me, when I say intelligence, I think this is the best way to encapsulate the versions of it that people are talking about all the time, right? This does lead to academic success, for example, is I go into my head more easily, more frequently. And every time we do a thing, it becomes easier to do it. So every time I'm presented with a problem, I think. That makes it easier to think the next time and think the next time and think. The problem is that thinking isn't always good. That's the part that needs to be recognized. It's not that intelligence that people are talking about doesn't exist. I think it does. I think it's this. And it just needs to be understood that if you're twice exceptional, it's not you're intelligent and also have this bad deficit thing. It's just like being tall or anything else. Here's the value, and here's the cost, and here are the downsides. It's harder for me to spur myself into action, right? Like, if I'm thinking more, and it therefore is easier for me to think in response to something, to try and process information and run scenarios before doing something, then conversely, that means it is harder for me to do something. And hey, look at that. We just explained almost all of ADHD right there. Harder for me to get into doing something, but very easy for me to think about stuff.
Yeah.
Even when I'm doing stuff, it's hard for me to get my attention on the thing that I'm doing, because instead I'm paying attention to the things that I'm thinking. Same with, we talked about autism just a moment ago, that if we think about it as disproportionately spending attentional resources on the conscious environment, the cognitive environment, rather than the physical environment, doesn't that explain a lot all of a sudden? Especially if you start tracking things over the course of a person's life, where if I'm hearing things constantly, right, and then learning and developing an ability to sift through that information and respond to it physically and some, connecting it to reality and whatever. If I hear things less frequently because I'm spending my attention up here, and then the physical sound and the environment doesn't call my attention as frequently, then my ability to utilize that information might be less developed than if I was hearing everything all the time.
Yeah.
Super common version of this is call it language processing. That's a very common way of talking about it. Cognitive miser theory. If I only need to hear 2 words out of the 20 that you said, and my brain can just fill in the gaps of what you probably meant, and I can then respond to you in a way, and you respond to my response as though my response made sense, then why would I listen to all 20 words? So a lot of it is that. Intelligence, another way of talking about it, is pattern recognition, pattern prediction, and data extrapolation, where if I'm going to count 1 to 10, single number at a time, and I say to a group of people, okay, I'm going to engage in a pattern here. As soon as you recognize the pattern, take it over, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. I might get to 8 before somebody says, oh, 9, 10, I got it. And we would say, wow, that's slow. They didn't recognize that pattern quickly. I might get to 3 and someone says, oh, 4, 5, 6, I know where you're going. I might get to 2 and people might say 3, 4, 5. The problem with it is the earlier you recognize that pattern, the faster you move, but the less certainty you have that you've gotten the correct pattern, because the less data you have to suggest. What if I was not doing 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to 10? What if I was doing the Fibonacci sequence, which also starts 1, 2, 3, and you jump in after 3, right? The earlier you jump in, the less likely it is that you are correct.
Yeah.
So look at all the problems that are caused by us thinking we got enough information to basically understand what something meant or what somebody was going to do, or I know where this is going. Somebody asks us a question and we don't answer the question. We respond to the point we think that they're eventually trying to make based on the question that they asked and imagining where that conversation will go. And now we just explained a whole hell of a lot of social difficulties and communication difficulties, right?
Right. I'm really sorry to say that we're out of time. But I would like to pick this up next week if that's okay with you, because it would be really nice to talk a little bit more about people who are smart but stuck, twice exceptional, and the scaffolding that we can put in place to support people, whether in the classroom or the workplace.
I like talking about this stuff. That'll be fun.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for stopping us, Marie. I appreciate it.
And I hope your next session goes well. And thanks for being here, everybody. And
Thank you, everybody.
Brandon.